This is a workshop sponsored by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at UT, and also in conjunction with COERLL, the Open Education Resources for Language Learning. So thanks to these two bodies, we have this thing going today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Andrew Lynch, Professor Andrew Lynch of the University of Miami. He's an associate professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies. And since 2005, he's directed their Spanish Heritage Language Program. Since 2013, he has served as editor-in-chief of the Heritage Language Journal, published by the National Heritage Language Resource Center at UCLA. His research and teaching focus broadly on sociolinguistics, societal language contact, and critical theories of language. He's published extensively on topics of Spanish in the U.S., Spanish language variation, and heritage language theory and research, and is co-author of El Español en Contacto con Otras Lenguas, published by Georgetown in 2009, and editor of the volume Spanish in the Global City, which is forthcoming from Routledge. He has given numerous conference talks, plenary addresses, and invited lectures in the U.S., Latin America, and Europe, and has been on CNN, NPR, BBC, London Radio, Netherlands, and Oppenheimer Presenta. His opinions have been cited in the Huffington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, and the AP, and Spain's Agencia EFE. I've been following him since he was a graduate student, an outstanding graduate student. And I'm also pleased to say he's a heritage language speaker himself.
Am I?
Don't ask me which
language. Common misconception.
So I'm pleased to present to you Dr. Andrew Lynch.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I get, are you a heritage speaker? Are you Cuban? No, I'm none of those things. So this morning, I want to respond to three questions that you'll see that the title of my talk actually relates more to the third question. I first thought I would do a talk about this in-between paradigm, and then the more I started working, I thought, well, let me consider some of the issues posed in these first two questions before I actually get to this matter of in-betweenness for heritage language learners or speakers in the US, and that will come more under the general topic of the third question. So the first question that we'll talk about or respond to is, who is a quote-unquote heritage Spanish speaker? The second question, is there such thing as U.S. Spanish? And if so, how is heritage Spanish, quote unquote, implicated in the context, in the concept of a U.S. Spanish? And the third question is, how much do U.S. Latino bilinguals have in common with native speakers of Spanish and with, we can say, intermediate to advanced second language speakers of Spanish? Is there language ability somehow? And I won't get into identity issues. I'm going to get more into language ability issues here, because identity is another entire talk that would last about 10 hours. Okay? Is there language ability somehow in between that of native and second language speakers or learners? So to the first question. From a theoretical standpoint, one of the most recurrent concerns in research published over the past decade has been how to define the term heritage vis-a-vis second and native language. An additional dimension of this concern that still is relatively unexplored, I think, regards the meaning that heritage assumes when it's placed before heritage speaker, heritage user, heritage learner. These all have very different sorts of connotations in institutional contexts, like those that concern us. A series of theoretical questions in relation to identity and language ability that I think have important practical implications come to mind. The first is, how much linguistic ability in the heritage language is necessary in order to qualify as a heritage language learner for purposes of education and as a heritage language speaker for purposes of our linguistic research. For example, Can a student who firmly believes that Cherokee is his heritage language, yet has little ability in Cherokee, be classified as a heritage learner? Does a U.S. Latina who has basic conversational fluidity and fairly robust comprehension abilities in Spanish, yet doesn't identify herself as a Spanish speaker, I hear this a lot in Miami, does that sort of person belong in a Spanish heritage language program or in a second language program? Are heritage language speakers of Cantonese or Hakka also heritage language learners of Chinese? This is a term that's become institutionally synonymous with Mandarin, but you know that the sociolinguistic and dialectal panorama in China is immense. Or would someone who's a speaker of Cantonese be a second language learner of Mandarin? Is the modern standard Arabic, or MSA, that's taught in classrooms really a heritage language, given the reality that no one ever speaks this variety at home in the Arab world? If you didn't know this, read a little bit. It's really fascinating, and it's hard for us as Westerners sometimes to wrap our mind around. How much should students own beliefs? This is the important question. How much should students own beliefs and perceptions about their ethnic or linguistic identities and their demonstrable oral language abilities enter into this equation and into our own research? Maria Carreira, in 2004, argued that we have to seek what she calls explanatory adequacy in defining heritage language learners, and that this definition has to encompass the notion of learner agency. Carreira sketches three categories in defining heritage language learners according to the relative importance. That's not what I wanted to go to. According to the relative importance that they assign to the following criteria here. Place in the community, personal connection to the heritage language and the heritage culture through family background, and finally, language proficiency in the heritage language. At the community level, the definition of the heritage language learner is relative to considerations like the number of community members that speak the heritage language, goals with respect to linguistic revitalization, which is important in the case of indigenous languages here in the US, and to language teaching resources. Community membership and not demonstrated language proficiency is the criterion, as you know, that largely determines most heritage language learners of indigenous language in the US. One may have a personal connection to the heritage language without being an active member of a community affiliated with the language. And in these cases, Van Dusen-Scholl has spoken of a learner with a heritage motivation. Not a heritage language learner, but a learner with a heritage motivation. So, of course, the issues of perceived community membership and language proficiency are not well defined, and they overlap each other in concentric ways at times. So there can be a mismatch between what the individual knows and identifies with as a heritage language and what institutional and educational powers that be, that would be us, actually ascribe to the individual. And the examples are more than a few. Think of heritage language speakers of Mexican and Central American indigenous languages who are rooted into Spanish heritage language courses. Speakers of, I've already mentioned this, the immensely diverse varieties observed throughout the Arab world who enroll in modern standard Arabic courses in which the target, quote unquote, heritage language, modern standard Arabic, for all practical structural purposes is just a second language. It's a different language. Or again, speakers of Cantonese or other local varieties found in mainland China who enroll in Chinese heritage language courses and find themselves also practically up against the task of learning a second language. Carreira suggests that, and I quote her, the relationship between proficiency in Spanish and heritage language learner identity is closely related to a number of sociolinguistic markers, including the number and density of speakers of the heritage language. So the city of Miami, for example, versus central Nebraska. The ratio of foreign-born to US-born Latinos, the range of contexts in which the heritage language is used, the economic value of Spanish, as well as English. End of quote. So in this way, actual language ability might be more of a factor in the perception and construction of Latino identity in Miami, say, than somewhere like San Antonio, for example, or Santa Fe. Carreira observes that community membership or personal connection actually hold little sway in determining heritage language status for classroom purposes. Out of 65 Chicago area school teachers who were asked to place a student with this profile in a Spanish second or heritage language classroom, 55 out of the 65 teachers placed this profile in a second language classroom. Born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, parents born in Texas, grandparents born in Mexico, doesn't speak Spanish at home, only with grandmother who visits twice a year from Mexico, understands Spanish but speaks haltingly, doesn't read or write Spanish, considers herself Chicana. Carreira argues that learners like this person who lack the requisite linguistic background to enroll in heritage language classes, but who nevertheless feel strongly connected to their ancestry, should be accommodated in a heritage language sequence if resources permit, mostly for reasons of identity. But we know that resources usually don't permit. So Carreira affirms, again, and I quote her, that although such students may behave linguistically like second language learners, they have identity needs that align them with heritage language learners. This gets us perhaps into the matter of historical membership also. Sarah Baudry in the context of Arizona, Damian Vergara Wilson in the context of New Mexico are in agreement with Carreira on this matter, and as much as I'm aware, New Mexico and Arizona probably have the most extensive in terms of sequence of courses and levels for Spanish as heritage language, and they're truly sort of model and I would say exemplary programs for what one might consider the trajectory of acquisition of Spanish as a heritage language. Vergara Wilson, in an article with Martinez in 2011 from the context of New Mexico, affirmed that using proficiency as a criterion in a definition of heritage language learner runs counter to one of that's the University of New Mexico's primary program goals, to revitalize, so again, this matter of revitalization, to revitalize Spanish in New Mexico among a population in which the language was deliberately eradicated. So the longstanding historical presence of Spanish in New Mexico is fundamental to their concerns, of course. Historical considerations in ancestry are also, as you would guess, at the heart of efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous languages. And concerning those, Rayner stated in 2010 that a primary goal and impetus of indigenous language revitalization programs is to reestablish the lost link to traditional values and culture. And as a side note of interest, I think that what's compelling in the context of Quechua and the Guarani speaking worlds in Paraguay and in the Andes of South America, and also in the Basque Country over in Spain, is that because so much of the population in those worlds is Spanish dominant, bilingual, the normativization and the formal acquisition of in institutional context of Quechua, Guarani, and Basque have given rise to an almost second language sort of code that some consider artificial, maybe kind of like a high variety in the sense of Ferguson's diglossia theory back in 1959. This is a kind of institutional code that appears artificial to the minority of non-Spanish dominant speakers. That would be Quechua dominant speakers who are bilingual, or Basque dominant speakers who are bilingual, or even to older monolinguals. So that's an important problem. And this is where sorts of phenomena related to what we might consider authenticity, speaker authenticity, would come into play for heritage language speakers, and I think for second language users all across the globe. So the issue of authenticity in terms of a heritage language identity are crucial, of course, to the success of heritage language acquirers. And I told you we won't have time to really talk much about identity per se today. But if you're interested, I can give you, and I'm sure Del can also, a long list of references dealing with identity. And I think Kim Potowski was here back in April. She does some excellent work on identity in heritage language programs in the US. So not only is the question of speaker authenticity important to initiatives and processes, let's say, of heritage language acquisition, but also the issue of anonymity, an anonymous voice in Spanish. And this relates to what we might call a US Spanish variety, and I'll get to that in just a moment. So let's say for our purposes here today, we'll characterize, because I know you probably expect I'm going to say, okay, so define heritage speaker for our purposes of Spanish in the US. There have been a lot of definitions put out there, and they're all pretty similar. And this is one that I would go with that I came up with last night, but it sounded good to me. English speaking, I hadn't been drinking. English speaking, English dominant individuals who were born and raised in the US, who grew up hearing and or speaking Spanish at home or among extended family members and in the community. They could have also been born in Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, etc., but came at an early age generally is the criterion. And they're principally what we would consider second or third generation members of immigrant families of Latin American origin, of which more than 60% are Mexican origin in the US, not in Miami, but in pretty much the rest of the US. And in Texas and in the Southwest, you all know better than I do that heritage speakers may identify as fourth, fifth, or even sixth generation speakers of Spanish. And that's the sort of phenomenon that University of Arizona and University of New Mexico have been so concerned with for many years now. So individuals like this with this sort of sociolinguistic profile that I just mentioned have been around for a long time, obviously. But we didn't begin to describe them as heritage language speakers until the late 90s, about the time I was finishing grad school and met Dale Quaking. So these are people whose social realities and linguistic realities were part of research on bilingualism, language contact, sociology of minority and immigrant languages throughout the 20th century, pretty much, well before anyone used the term heritage. And if you look carefully at Carmen Silva Corvalan's what I would now consider classic or seminal study. She might not appreciate my calling her work a classic at this point. Seminal study of 3 generations of Mexican Spanish in Los Angeles, which was published in 1994, you won't find the term heritage anywhere in the text. So even in 1994, people were not really using that term to describe these sorts of individuals or groups. The term, so where did it come from, you say? Well, the term got to us here in the US during the late 90s from, anyone want to guess where it came from? An institutional? Canada. Yeah, Canada. It emerged in Canada in 1977 during the inception of the Ontario Heritage Language Programs to revitalize and support French speaking, principally in the Ottawa Hull region, but all throughout Ontario. So at the time, here in the US, during the late 1970s, scholars of bilingual education and minority language studies, oh, there's that definition. Gus, I'm sorry, I forgot to project that. I just stated that. So during the late 1970s, scholars of bilingual education and minority language studies, Guadalupe Valdez is one of the most widely cited among them, spoke of native speakers or bilingual speakers. And in one of her original articles that I would also consider seminal or a classic, and I don't know if Guadalupe would like me calling her a classic either, widely cited article, she affirmed that what you see here, defining native language instruction for the profession is simply a question of deciding exactly what teaching a standard dialect of a language involves. She urged that learners must hone a dedication to bringing about the acquisition of educated language use to include an overall development of total proficiency as characteristic of educated speakers of any language. And I want to draw emphasis on this notion of total proficiency because that's going to be of concern to us when I talk about the concept of incomplete acquisition. That's the term that's more common now. Guadalupe Valdez was not alone in the pursuit. I recently came across this doctoral dissertation of a former student right here in your department at UT Austin back in the year I was born, 1971, teaching Spanish as a standard dialect in grades 7 through 12, a rationale for a fundamental skills approach. So the general, does anyone know G. Blanco? You know who, you do? George Blanco. Oh, that's okay, that's the same person. Good to know that. So the general sense at the time, 46 years ago, I just told you my age, that's cool. The general sense at the time, 40 years ago, was that language learners that we would now call heritage speakers were, back then, bilinguals or native speakers, as commonly understood in linguistic research up to that time. Interestingly, just about the time that the use of the term heritage language got started here in the US academic context, the government of Ontario, whence it had come, replaced it with the term international language. Because they decided that heritage relegates language to the past, as if some sort of ancestral tradition that was on the wane or on the decline. And it's also important to note that in Canada, through all of this, French did not fall under the rubric of heritage language. It referred more to the indigenous languages of Canada. However, Spanish, as you know, has very obviously fallen under the rubric of heritage language here in the US setting. In the Canadian context, Baker and Jones in 1998 noted that, so that's George Blanco, of course. The danger of the term heritage language, is that relative to powerful majority languages, it points more to the past and less to the future, to traditions rather than to the contemporary. The danger is that the heritage language becomes associated with ancient cultures, past traditions, and more primitive times. This is also true of the terms ethnic used in the US and ancestral. These terms may fail to give the impression of a modern international language that is of value in a technological society. More recently, Ofelia Garcia has made the same argument here in the context of Spanish in the US. This is from a 2014 piece, which is great. I'll give you the reference if you want it. It's a very interesting, thought-provoking read. She says that although Spanish classes for bilingual Latinos have proliferated in both universities and secondary schools, they've not gone far enough in developing Latino bilinguals. Rather than recognizing that the students in these programs are Spanish-speaking or bilingual, the field has recently taken up the term heritage language. And I guess as editor of Heritage Language Journal, I'm implicated in that. Spanish is now relegated to a past that is quote-unquote foreign, the Spanish of Latin American countries or Spain, but not recognized as an indigenous language practice of the United States, autochthonous to the United States. In addition, she says the term heritage language contributes to the silencing of US bilingualism. She goes further. The heritage language movement has done little to stop the erasure or silencing of the bilingualism of the Latino community. As with the term heritage language program, the phrase dual language, as in dual language education, what Kim talked about in April here with you. April, she was here? Yeah. Says something about the silencing of bilingualism in the US and the distancing of these programs from the Latino community. By constructing Spanish as a language of poverty, silencing the bilingualism of US Latinos, and insisting, let's see, I think this is my next slide, sorry about that. By constructing Spanish as a language of poverty, silencing the bilingualism of US Latinos, and insisting that English is Latinos' second language, white English monolinguals enjoy privilege. At the same time that US schools insist on devaluing the Spanish of Latino students, other political hegemonic forces have started to promote Spanish as a so-called global language. And finally, she says that to educate bilingual Latino students, US educators would have to stop treating the interdependent practices of their bilingual Latinos as those of racialized, subaltern others, separating them into two untouchable global languages, Spanish on one hand, English on the other, that schools then evaluate as incomplete. And again, we'll get to the notion of incomplete acquisition and proficiency in just a bit. So I'm hoping that all of this serves to direct our thought to contesting some of the terms that we employ in reference to ways of speaking and using Spanish in the US. And I'm not here to advocate for use of the term heritage language or against the term heritage language. I just wanted to point out some of the baggage that's involved in these terms and what can be in the mix of connotations when we use these terms with students and with parents and in communities and with administrators. Did I say administrators? That's very important. This takes me to the second question. Is there such thing as a US Spanish? And if so, how is heritage Spanish implicated in the concept of a US Spanish? So the question here is it more accurate and appropriate to speak of el español de los Estados Unidos or el español en los Estados Unidos? Spanish of the US or US Spanish or Spanish in the US? So I think I'm kind of in the minority among my peers and colleagues. People like Kim Potowski or Domnita Domescu or Glenn Martinez or a long list of other people. I'm kind of in the minority, but along with Carmen Silva-Corvalán, I think. So at least I'm not that far off the map, right? In expressing great reluctance to use terms like Español estadounidense or Español de los Estados Unidos. So before you start throwing darts, let me tell you why. I've argued before that there's really no U.S. Spanish variety in a sort of singular monolithic sense to speak of according to traditional sociolinguistic criteria for two main reasons. The first, a lack of community-based norms of usage owed fundamentally to the lack of generational continuity of Spanish in the U.S. In other words, those who would actually go about forging or constructing or being the agents in developing, if you will, and putting into practice a very particular U.S. Spanish of variety would be those who would, in theory, be third, fourth generation speakers, right? But what happens by the time we get to the third and fourth generation of Spanish speakers in the U.S.? They're already English dominant, and their variety of Spanish becomes, according to some scholars, incomplete. And again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. The second criterion or problem that I point to is readily apparent patterns of what you call discontinuity, according to the variationist model. That is, a lack of a shared set of norms for the interpretation of language as would be reflected in the treatment of linguistic variables like social stratification, style shifting, subjective evaluations of particular uses of language, etc. So in other words, what William Labov termed orderly heterogeneity, normally resting on a uniform structural base. So our language varies, but there's kind of a uniform structural base in the sense of society or community. And remember, his arguments were independent of the notion of underlying mental grammars, which is always a different kind of paradigm in linguistics. So we could argue that this is what seems to be impeding the coalescence of what you might think of as a consensual common variety, or at least a series of varieties in this country beyond the first generation of Spanish speakers who immigrate here to the U.S. Furthermore, if you say there is such thing as U.S. Spanish, then I would ask you who are the speakers whose voices would be representative of that variety? This is the next step of the question. Where do we see or hear U.S. Spanish as a particular kind of variety? Is there such thing, and this is the more important part of this, is there such thing as a variety of Spanish spoken in the U.S. that is not also indexical of another additional or co-occurring national identity? In other words, Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Salvadoran, Colombian, even in Miami, which is always held up as the model of the Spanish-speaking city in the U.S., right? I think it is. Even in Miami, when a second or third generation speaker opens her mouth, there's always the sense of, oh, she's Cuban. Oh, she's Colombian background. Oh, she's Salvadoran background. Or if people for some reason can't get that right away, they usually just ask, ¿De dónde son tus padres? ¿De dónde es tu familia? It's always a sense of de dónde. Where did it come from? There's not the notion that it could organically be from here or be situated here. So that's my kind of problem with the use of the term Español de Estados Unidos. I'm not opposed to it, I just take issue with it. So I don't think there's such thing. If there is one, I would think it's probably the socially engineered variety of so-called Español neutro, or neutral Spanish, that's heard in U.S. Spanish language mass media. So like if you turn on Univision or something like that, or Spanish language programming that's produced here in the US, that supposedly, and they make a concerted effort that's quite explicit to project a neutral Spanish that everyone will identify with, but in reality, no one ends up identifying with it. This goes back to the big hurdle for standard varieties of Basque in the Basque Country, Galician in Spain. You hear these same sorts of comments about those languages in that context. And I want to play just a clip for you here. I wanted to play a clip for you of some comments from people on the street in Miami. So a couple of years ago or so, I sent a graduate student out into the street with a camera to just, for a few days, walk around Miami and pose to people the question of, you know, is there such thing as a U.S. Spanish? And what do you perceive, or how would you characterize neutral Spanish in the context of the U.S.? And these are things that people all around Miami said to us. And you'll get, I think, a clearer sense here of what I was saying earlier about particular varieties being indexical of identities beyond the U.S. identity.
Bueno, la mayoría yo creo que han nacido aquí porque son ya de segunda generación que vienen para acá de los padres y nacen aquí y aprenden a hablar español con los padres.
Si una familia crece y ellos crean alguna familia de niños, a lo mejor las padres no le hablan mucho en español, entonces se pierde el dialecto sobre el tiempo.
La manera de hablar no es tan latino como debiera ser.
Que si en la zona aquí se habla neutro según las personas de otras nacionalidades. Mira, en este barrio te puedo explicar, hay muchas personas de otras nacionalidades, dominicanos, cubanos, mexicanos, hondureños, puertorriqueños. Entonces tú tienes que hablar a veces neutral porque hay muchas palabras del mismo país mío que no la conocen.
Cuando vienen artistas de otros países, bien sea con un español un poco marcado, como el argentino, el Colombia, el de Venezuela, esos países, o incluso en Puerto Rico, Cuba, tienen que hacer un curso con una especialidad de español que sea de lengua mexicana.
Bueno, usualmente los reporteros creo que son los que más tienen un español neutro, si se puede decir. Pero si entrevistan a alguien, depende del país que sea, te puedes dar cuenta si, de dónde son por el español que hablan o el slang que usen también.
Por lo general yo sé, porque pongámosle, si es el noticiero de Univisión, ya sé que es mexicano.
Según yo, puede venir de México, porque en México hay una tradición de los medios de comunicación audiovisual muy grande.
No es que me importe, pero si yo quiero que mi novela o mi proyecto se vea a todo el público y todo el mundo lo entienda, quiero que lo entiendan de un idioma que todos lo entiendan. No voy a poner a alguien que se ponga a hablar según su cultura, cómo hablan, porque no vamos a entender lo que está diciendo. Quiero que todos entiendan lo que está diciendo mi artista. Quiero que se sepa expresar, y pienso que en el idioma perfecto sería el mexicano en este caso.
Muy pocas veces lo oigo, pero entonces me quedo así como, ¿de dónde son esta gente? Porque suenan cubanos, pero no son cubanos, son puertorriqueños o puede ser nicaragüenses.
Okay, so I mentioned Carmen Silva Corvalán earlier, and she kind of agrees with me on this. We were on a panel together last weekend at Instituto Cervantes at Harvard, and she also expressed doubt about the existence of a representative variety of Spanish that could be perceived and classified as U.S. Spanish. You've heard people in Miami say this, probably people who know nothing about linguistics or Spanish as a heritage language education. So it's the Spanish. She, however, affirmed that if there is a such thing as Español de Estados Unidos, it would be the Spanish spoken by the second generation born and raised in the U.S. But then the question comes in, are we only including those of the second generation who are fluent Spanish speakers? What about those who are not? Okay. In fact, Ricardo Otegui said in a very interesting article published last year in a critique of incomplete acquisition, the hypothesis of incomplete acquisition, he argued that people who sincerely claim a strongly felt Latino, that is, heritage language identity, but whose early childhood experiences are such that it's very unlikely that a Spanish heritage language grammar would have formed, do not qualify, according to him, for research investigating second-generation bilingual Spanish competence. And I think it's important that moving beyond terminology in heritage language research in the years ahead, if we continue to use the term heritage language. We probably won't. I don't know. Focus should be placed on contexts in which heritage language, sociolinguistic and linguistic behavior in the mental grammatical sense can be predictably different from that of first-generation native speakers or monolinguals in beyond the U.S. So this would also be a call, graduate students, I think, for further research on speaker identities, the role of ideologies in HL and heritage language settings, language use in the workplace. This is a big one that has gone largely unexplored in heritage language studies. It's a very important issue. And also community engagement and service learning, which is starting to, and I'll make a quick plug for the journal here. Heritage Language Journal published a special issue in December 2016 dedicated to community engagement and service learning. And there are some very good articles there on Spanish community engagement and service learning here in the U.S. So we move now to the third and final question, which is, how much do U.S. Latino bilinguals have in common with native speakers of Spanish and with, let's say, intermediate to advanced second language speakers of Spanish? Is there a language ability somehow in between that of native and second language speakers or learners? So a lot of research on language per se, since, I guess, the beginning of time, has been circumscribed to comparisons. This is what we do in analytical critical research. We compare things. We look for differences and similarities. The preponderance of comparisons in heritage language acquisition research and in bilingualism research in general throughout the 20th century, I think reflects, and especially in heritage language research, reflects what you might think of as an intuitive, highly intuitive, that is, unscientific, supposedly. Intuition could be scientific, who knows? Not yet, but we'll get there. An intuitive sort of social and cultural reality in which heritage language speakers with high-level abilities are frequently perceived as not quite native. You sound native, but there's something that's not quite to me, right? You hear people make these kinds of evaluations. While those, on the other hand, who are low proficiency heritage language speakers, low proficiency repertoires, can be viewed as exceptional or problematic second language users. In either case, the heritage language usage or performance of language in everyday sorts of settings often, as you know, elicits commentary, sometimes snide remarks, sometimes jokes, sometimes positive comments also. And the ensuing conversation then perceptually confronts heritage language speakers with some imagined native speaker, or, on the other hand, a stereotyped second language learner. So as the field develops, there's growing consensus, we can begin to say, that heritage language speakers are more similar in, I guess, slightly most regards to first language speakers in reflecting first language acquisition processes, okay, than they are to second language speakers or learners. However, there's still a pretty long list of studies that find a lot of similarities with respect to specific grammatical features between heritage language speakers, specifically lower proficiency, third, fourth generation speakers, and what you consider intermediate level second language learners, okay? And also, it's important to point out here that although the similarities of lower level heritage language speakers and intermediate to advanced proficiency second language speakers remain generally unexplored. There's still not a lot of research there. A lot of the research is based on higher proficiency second or even third generation heritage speakers, comparing them to sort of what you consider characteristic intermediate second language learners. And I don't think a lot of the similarities would come out if you're comparing those two groups. You'd have to get more into comparing what you'd perceive as lower level heritage language proficiency and intermediate to low advanced second language learners. So that would be a further, I guess, concern or suggestion I might have for future research. So whether they be simultaneous or sequential bilinguals, if you buy into that argument about simultaneous versus sequential, heritage language speakers present intriguing possibilities for investigation for several reasons. First, they fulfill the age of acquisition criterion. They meet the critical period, so-called, right, for successful learning of the language because they're typically exposed to the heritage language since birth. Many acquire and use the heritage language almost exclusively during early childhood. Second, they generally lack advanced literacy skills in the heritage language. And finally, they afford us insights into the potential range of native speakerhood and the interface of bilingualism and second language acquisition, since the heritage language becomes a secondary language beyond childhood. Not second language, but secondary language. These facts lead us to questions regarding outcomes, what you might call outcomes of heritage language acquisition and use. The first, what is the trajectory of heritage language acquisition, or to put it differently, what are the learning outcomes in adult heritage language speakers? Second, what factors may condition those outcomes? And I think, I don't have a whole lot of time, but I did want to play you some voices of heritage speakers of Cuban Spanish in Miami. And we can think perhaps a little bit about what you're hearing in terms of proficiency before I get into the matter of Marta, ¿cómo estás? Qué bueno verte. We'll get into the discussion of incomplete acquisition. This is good that I get a little exercise. Guessing there's enough copies. ¿Qué tal? Usted. Oh, they made their way over here. Get this circulating here para usted. There's some more. Does anybody else need a Carlos? Anybody else? So I'll play four short examples of second and third generation. There are a couple of second generation Cuban Spanish speakers here and a couple of third generation Cuban Spanish speakers here. Oh gosh, and I'm going to have to go out of this again. Escape. But escape doesn't show up. It's on the keyboard down here. Here we go. Okay, yay. These recordings are from a few years back, before Fidel Castro passed away. And I'm asking these second and third generation Cuban Spanish speakers, ¿qué pasaría aquí en Miami? O ¿cómo reaccionaría la comunidad cubana aquí en Miami si mañana muriera Castro? Okay. And the focus was on hypothetical discourse, and I'd like for you to kind of pay attention to what they're doing with verb forms, how they're expressing doubt and hypotheticality and conjecturing about what the situation would be, and then you can give me some sense of what you would characterize as their proficiency. So here goes the first one.
Oh my God, fueran fiestas por todas partes. Yo no creo que la gente se fuera, no creo. Creo que irían de visita, sacarían a la familia, no, fuera distinto. La comunidad cubana estuviera extremadamente feliz, pero no creo que se fuera, porque la mayoría ya tienen sus familias aquí. Quizás los que acabaron de llegar hace un año, 2 años, quizás sí se fueran, pero como mi familia, que ya hace 20 y pico años que está aquí. ¿Se quedarían? No, sí. ¿Hasta tus abuelos se quedarían? Sí, mis abuelos por seguro, ellos se quedarían.
Dice que hay muchos cubanos que ahora están en la isla. ¿Se vendrían para acá, para Miami?
Sí, yo creo que sí. Yo creo que hubiera como un cambio. Mucha gente fueran para allá y hubiera gente que viniera para acá. Yo creo que más vinieran para acá. Nada más que por conocer qué es lo que es Miami, qué es lo que es los Estados Unidos. Porque siempre en Cuba, desde chiquito, siempre hemos ido, vamos para Cuba, vamos para América. A lo mejor vinieran, visitaran y después regresarían, no sé, dependería. Pero para que Cuba se vuelva a poner como estaba esos años.
So, catch that second to the last line. Vinieran, visitaban, y después regresarían. I love that. Here's the next one.
Si tuvieras la oportunidad de visitar a Cuba, ¿irías?
Creo que sí.
Whoops.
Si tuvieras la oportunidad de visitar a Cuba, ¿irías?
Creo que sí, para verlo, pero no. Ahora tengo una mente que no me va a gustar lo que voy a ver.
¿No?
No.
¿Por qué?
Tengo una prima costarricense que viaja para la Julia Laxa.
Y ella también es de ascendencia cubana.
No, ella nació en Costa Rica.
Ok. Pero la padre es cubano.
Sí, el papá de ella es cubano.
Es cubano.
Pero ella ha viajado mucho a Cuba y visitado familia que vive ahí. Y ha traído fotos y todo esto, y historias. Y, o sea, también no me gustan, o sea, porque estoy leyendo las historias que mis padres me han dicho de cuando ellos eran jóvenes, a las historias que estoy leyendo ahora. La isla se ha cambiado mucho. Y no es lo mismo. No sé si es la palabra correcta, despreciado. I can't even think of the word.
¿Qué es en inglés?
It's deteriorated.
Deteriorada.
Sí.
Deteriorada.
Mucho. Hasta las partes de la isla que dicen que son bonitas para la gente visitar y que son buenas para los turistas, hasta esas partes son de tan alta calidad.
You get a sense of difference between the first and the second? Yeah, I think most do. This is what the idea of incomplete acquisition points at. The second speaker we heard would be, in some sense, lacking, for lack of a better word. She's struggling to find words at times. There's less of a sense of fluency. There's not disfluency, but there's less of a sense of fluency than the first one that we heard. For time's sake, I'll just play one more because I know you want to hear all of them. We will, or maybe you don't, I don't know. We'll look at just the third one there.
Muchos se daban alegría y eso, pero en sí no sé cómo, porque ya...
And when he says se daban alegría, he's speaking hypothetically in a possible future. He's not referring to the past, okay?
Los cubanos que ya viven ahora aquí en Miami, ya es tanto rato que no han visitado a Cuba, que ya el sistema es tan diferente, que se pasaban hasta visitar Cuba, pero muchos se quedaron en Miami y se ponían alegres, pero en sí no había mucho cambio de regresar para atrás para Cuba, lo dudo.
No. Pocos volverían. ¿Piensas que tus padres volverían?
No, eso ya ellos lo hablaron, que no, ellos compraron una casa para visitar, para vacaciones, pero de vivir para atrás en Cuba.
¿Y tú no irías a vivir ahí?
El de vivir en sí, no, visitar sí, pero para vivir no.
Okay, here's the last
Y mañana muriera Castro.
Hicieron una locura, es muy crazy. Todo el mundo viniendo para acá, yendo para allá.
¿Piensas que muchos volverían a la isla?
La mayoría de las personas dicen que sí, pero yo no creo. Yo creo que la mayoría. Porque ya, yo me imagino como que se quedaron más de 5 años o 7 años que ya se quedaron, que ya llegaron aquí. Yo creo que ellos se quedarían.
Se quedarían aquí.
Se quedarían aquí. Ya ellos que se establecieron en Miami, como mi padre dicen, si hiciera libre yo visitaba, pero
Okay, so I don't have a lot of time left, and as usual, I was highly ambitious in the plan of things. I was going to share with you some results of research that I can send you references, and I'll certainly share the PowerPoint with everyone. And this is all evidence of a lot of excellent work, very solid research from Silvina Montrul, looking at different grammatical features of the grammars of second and third generation heritage speakers, and finding that that apparently there is a sort of, so these are simultaneous bilinguals, sequential bilinguals compared with native speakers, and this is a percentage of accuracy in differential object marking. So, él besó a María versus él besó María, the lack of the a in there. And so you can see the difference here between the groups. And like this example, there are many in grammatical systems. Another thing that's important to point to is the high degree of variability. This top dark, again, this is from Silvina Montrul's excellent 2015 book on acquisition of heritage languages. I would recommend it if you're interested in grammars and questions of heritage language grammar and acquisition. And this is from the same study on differential object marking. You can see the dark black line up there is percentage of accuracy among older native speakers and younger native speakers. If you look at the simultaneous and sequential bilinguals, you can see a lot of variability. Some of them are up there in terms of accuracy with the older native speakers, and others are down. There's a lot of variability, and this is what has to be, I think, the focus of future research. We've not even begun to scratch the surface yet of variability in heritage language repertoires. So, however, this is all very convincing, right? But very quickly, not everyone agrees with the primordiality of input in the equation of what you would call incomplete acquisition. Putnam and Sanchez emphasized in a 2013 article that's an excellent read that focus must shift from heritage language grammars as a result or outcome of incomplete acquisition to heritage language grammars as a process of acquisition. And they said that input in terms of quality or quantity is not the only factor determining heritage language acquisition. Until suitable answers to fundamental questions such as how much data is enough, even for monolingual first language acquisition of features and structures, and how exactly does one measure and compare sufficient with insufficient primary linguistic input. Until answers for those questions are found, they say, arguments in favor of an insufficient input hypothesis is the primary, if not principal, factor for the often simplified structures and paradigms found in heritage languages are difficult to uphold. Another excellent article in Heritage Language Journal from O'Grady, Lee, and Lee, they say, what matters for language acquisition is not so much the frequency of particular forms as it is the frequency of clear-cut instantiations of mappings between form and meaning. That is, children don't learn the past tense suffix or the definite article simply by encountering forms ed and the, for example, in English. Rather, learning takes place only to the extent that children encounter situations in which forms can be successfully linked to a corresponding semantic function, thereby creating mappings. And also key here is the notion of output. And this would go back to the debate back in the 80s and 90s in second language acquisition about the necessity of output in relation to input. Input is not, in other words, input would only be half the dialectic. The actual production and the effort that's involved mentally and socially in putting into production the language would be the other important part of that equation. Ricardo Otegui has also offered some very thought-provoking, in the past couple of years, criticisms of the incomplete acquisition paradigm. And he says, second-generation bilingual acquirers in the US build grammars that differ partially from those of the previous generation. On this account, they are the same as monolingual children acquiring Spanish in Latin America and Spain. For these children, too, end up with grammars that differ at specific points from those of the previous generation. The construct of incomplete acquisition is thus not useful as a unique characterization of second-generation bilinguals. He goes further. The notion of incomplete acquisition is undoubtedly a proposal related to mental grammar put forth within the science of linguistics, and yet, disturbingly, the argument for the incomplete condition of the mental grammar of a second-generation bilingual depends crucially on the social category Spanish, since the errors of informants are detectable only by comparison with the linguistic behavior of other speakers who also fall under the social label Spanish. This takes us to Ofelia Garcia's related and kind of linked argument about translanguaging in bilingual education, and those of you who worked in language education will already be familiar with that. I don't have time to talk about it, but I can send you references if you'd like. Ofelia Garcia says, schools would have to recognize Latino translanguaging as a discursive practice of true bilingual North Americans in order to extend their language practices to those recognized as standard academic language, whether English or Spanish. Translanguaging differs from code switching, and this is where a lot of people take issue, how code switching is different than translanguaging, in that it refers not simply to a shift between two languages, Spanish on one hand, English on the other, but to the use of complex discursive practices that cannot be assigned to one or another code, and that gives voice to oppressed and minoritized language practices. This argument is starting to get a lot of pushback. This is kind of a hot topic debate right now. Is incomplete acquisition a thing or not? And if we can agree that it is, we should be calling it something other than incomplete acquisition, but no one that I know of has come up with a good alternative term. One of the best responses that just came out a few months ago from Jeff McSwan, who's at the University of Maryland. I'll give you this reference if you're interested. It's an excellent read, as is Ofelia Garcia's argument for translanguaging. They give a lot to think about. McSwan says, countering the argument about translanguaging not being code switching, et cetera, McSwan says the consequences of denying the existence of multilingualism and therefore of code switching are far-reaching. If code switching doesn't exist, then neither does the empirical basis for the repudiation of a deficit perspective on language mixing, a critically important and frequently cited body of basic scientific research. So in some ways, people want to move away from the notion of language deficit theory, but on the other hand, you know that federal support and state support for bilingual education programs have always been predicated upon the argument of deficit and need. And so there's kind of a catch-22 there that is an important point of discussion. So, conclusions, future research. I won't go through what I had prepared here, but heritage language variability, I already pointed to the issue with this. Consistent assessment methodologies applied uniformly across different communities so we can get into even richer and I think more meaningful comparisons. As much as I know there's not been a methodologically consistent study that's compared third-generation Cubans to third-generation in Miami, to third-generation Mexicans in LA, to third-generation Dominicans in New York, and third-generation Puerto Ricans in Chicago. You get my sense, right? We're all doing, I think, interesting work and very different kinds of work, but when I compare my studies with Carmen Silva of Correllans in Los Angeles, or with Kim Potowski's in Chicago, or with Ricardo Otegui's in New York, the comparisons are always iffy, questionable, because we've done kind of different things with different methodologies in particular ways. We probably all would agree with each other if we sat down at the table, but the point is no one has systematically employed uniform sorts of criteria in these things. So, third point, principles and pedagogical practices. Pedagogy and questions of what happens in the classroom and the traditional SLA paradigm of pre and post instruction, how heritage language learners fare after a particular kind of intervention in the pedagogical sense. Extremely few studies of that. It's almost embarrassing. And as editor of the Heritage Language Journal, I can tell you we get very few submissions that actually have to do with classroom intervention and what the outcome was. Those studies are greatly needed. Speaker agency and identities, we've already mentioned this. Passing is native in terms of contextually situated language performativity. The question of passing, Ingrid Pillar has worked on this, not in the context of heritage languages, but in the context of second language acquisition. There's a lot involved here in terms of performativity and those moments that one is perceived as native and then says something and they go, ¿De dónde son tus padres? Or, right? Or, ¿Tú naciste dónde? Right? I hear those sorts of questions all the time in Miami. And so this is an interesting phenomenon, especially in terms of identity. Roles of ideologies. Jenny Lehman has done an excellent job of formulating this issue in the field. Community engagement and service learning and L2HL learner interactions in the classroom. A lot of research is needed there. Florencia Henshaw has done some very interesting studies with regard to this. I can give you those references. And finally, in terms of mental grammars and cognitivism, language processing difficulties. And I have to stop there, and I'll just put this out there as my conclusion. Heritage language research should be viewed as an extension of research on native speaker competence or ability in a general sense, but methodologically and institutionally viewed through the prism of second language acquisition in more specific and local circumstances. Some of my peers would disagree with me on this, so I'll leave you with that. Thank you. Muchas gracias.